The year is 399 BC. The Athenian agora, the heart of the city-state, teems with life. Merchants haggle, citizens debate, and philosophers gather. Amidst the vibrant chaos, an old man stands, his face etched with thought, his gaze piercing. This is Socrates, a figure both revered and ridiculed. He engages a young, eager student, Crito, in conversation. Around them, others pause, drawn by Socrates' relentless questioning. Athens, a beacon of democracy, prided itself on its freedoms. Yet even in this cradle of liberty, the state held ultimate power. It was a power that, when threatened, could turn against any of its citizens. Socrates, a man who sought truth above all else, would soon discover the limits of that freedom. His relentless questioning, his pursuit of wisdom, would be perceived not as a civic virtue, but as a dangerous affront to the established order. Socrates engages Crito, asking if a man truly knows justice if he can only define it by the assembly's dictates, or if he merely repeats others' words. Crito paused, considering the question. A group of citizens, including Meletus and Anytus, passed by, casting disdainful glances at Socrates. Crito affirmed that such a man merely repeated words. True knowledge came from within, from rigorous examination. Socrates then questioned if it was just to obey unexamined laws, based on convenience rather than truth. Meletus stopped, his eyes narrowing, muttering to Anytus about Socrates always sowing doubt and undermining the city's foundations. Anytus grimly nodded, agreeing that Socrates' influence was growing, along with the insolence of the young. Socrates' method was simple yet revolutionary. He would engage individuals in dialogue, asking a series of questions that exposed contradictions in their beliefs. This was not done to humiliate, but to lead them to a deeper understanding, to the realization of their own ignorance. However, for those who held power, for those whose authority rested on unquestioned assumptions, this method was a direct challenge. It was a threat to the very fabric of their control. Meletus sat at a table, a scroll spread before him. Meletus, tapping the scroll, declared their charges clear: impiety and corrupting the youth, claiming Socrates denied the city's gods and introduced new deities, teaching young men to question their elders and scorn tradition. Anytus forcefully added that Socrates had corrupted his own son, filling his head with questions and making him disdain honest trade, asserting that this was not philosophy but subversion. Lycone noted that the city was still recovering from the war and tyranny, craving stability, and that Socrates' questioning and association with figures like Critias made him dangerous. The backdrop to Socrates' trial was a city still reeling. The Peloponnesian War, a devastating conflict against Sparta, had ended in Athens' humiliating defeat. The subsequent reign of the 30 tyrants, an oligarchic regime supported by Sparta, had been a brutal period of political purges and execution. Though democracy had been restored, a deep-seated paranoia lingered. The state, weakened and vulnerable, sought to reassert control, to eliminate any perceived threats to its fragile stability. Socrates, by his very nature, represented a challenge to this desire for unquestioning conformity. Meletus, standing, his voice raising, declared that Socrates must be made an example, for this was not merely about him, but the authority of Athens, the sanctity of its laws, and the very future of its democracy. Anytus nodded, stating that the assembly must be seen that no one, not even a philosopher, was above the law. The Athenian public court is a vast open space. Hundreds of citizens, the jury, sat on wooden benches. Socrates stood before them, calm and composed, facing his accusers. Meletus, Anytus, and Lycone stood opposite him, presenting their case. There were no professional lawyers, no judges in the modern sense. Citizens acted as both accusers and jurors. The sheer size of the jury, often numbering in the hundreds or even thousands, was meant to ensure democratic representation. However, it often meant that trials were swayed by emotion, rhetoric, and political sentiment rather than strict legal precedents. Socrates would argue his own defense, a solitary voice against the collective will of the state. Meletus, addressing the jury with impassioned voice, prosecuted Socrates for the crime against the city's soul, claiming he denied the recognized gods, introduced new spiritual beings, and corrupted the youth by teaching them disrespect for elders and to scorn tradition. Socrates listened, his expression unreadable. Anytus stepped forward, his voice grave, asserting that Socrates had undermined respect for law, tradition, and institution, and that his teachings led to anarchy, like the instability of the 30 tyrants, concluding that such a man could not be allowed to roam free, poisoning young minds. The charges against Socrates were vague, open to interpretation. Impiety could mean anything from atheism to introducing foreign religious practices. Corrupting the youth was an even broader accusation, easily manipulated to target any unconventional teaching. These charges represent the state's attempt to control thought, to enforce conformity, and to punish individuals for the peaceful expression of ideas. Not content with merely protecting citizens from harm, the state sought to dictate their beliefs and influence their intellectual development. Addressing the jury, Socrates urged them to consider the truth of his accusers' claims, not their eloquence. He questioned how he corrupted the youth, suggesting it was by encouraging them to examine their lives, seek virtue, and understand true goodness, implying that if it was a corruption, then all who sought wisdom were corrupt. Regarding impiety, Socrates stated he had always acknowledged a divine sight, a voice warning him against wrongdoing, clarifying this was not a new god, but a personal guide. He denied rejecting the city's gods, stating he merely sought to understand them more deeply, to live a life pleasing them through virtue and self-examination. Socrates' defense was not a plea for mercy, but a continuation of his philosophical mission. He refused to beg, to flatter, or to compromise his principles. He challenged the jury to look beyond the accusations and consider the true nature of his activities. He argued that questioning, far from corrupting, was a service to the city, a constant push towards self-improvement and moral clarity. This was an act of profound intellectual courage, a refusal to bow to the demands of the state, even when his life hung in the balance. Socrates continued, stating that he was a gadfly sent by the gods to sting Athens from its slumber, and that if they put him to death, they would not easily find another like him. He declared that he did not fear death, believing no harm could come to a good man, either in life or the afterlife. His only fear was to betray the truth. He looked directly at the jury, his gaze steady. He argued that his duty was to the truth, not to the uncritical acceptance of state dogma. His willingness to face death rather than abandon his principles stands as a powerful testament to the importance of intellectual freedom and the dangers of allowing the state to define what is permissible thought. The jury had voted. The initial verdict was guilty. The penalty phase began. Socrates was asked to propose his own punishment. In Athenian law, after a guilty verdict, both the prosecution and the defense proposed a penalty, and the jury chose between them. The prosecution had proposed death. Socrates, instead of proposing exile or a fine, chose a path that further solidified his defiance. Calmly addressing the jury, Socrates proposed free meals for a life spent in service of the city, urging them to care for their souls and for virtue. A ripple of shock and outrage passed through the jury, with some shouting in protest. Socrates' proposal was not an act of arrogance, but a profound statement. It was a direct challenge to the state's values, a claim that intellectual and moral pursuit was worth more than conventional achievements. This further alienated many jurors, who saw it as contempt for the court. Socrates continued, unwavering, explaining that proposing a fine would mean admitting guilt, which he could not do. He reasoned that exile would only lead him to face the same accusations in another city, and that his mission was in Athens. Therefore, he proposed the only fitting reward for a life dedicated to truth. The jury voted again, this time on the penalty. The decision was swift and final. The jury, perhaps insulted by Socrates' proposal, perhaps swayed by fear and resentment, voted for the death penalty. The margin was closer than the initial guilty verdict, but the outcome was irreversible. The state had spoken. Dissent, even in the form of philosophical inquiry, was not to be tolerated when it challenged the established order. An official announcement that Socrates was condemned to death, with the sentence to be carried out by drinking hemlock. Socrates stood motionless, accepting the verdict with an almost serene calm. Crito rushed forward, his face a mask of grief, whispering heartbroken pleas for another way, for Socrates to escape and think of his sons. Socrates gently placed a hand on Crito's shoulder, urging him not to grieve, and questioned if they were to uphold justice only when convenient. He spoke of their paths diverging, one to die, the other to live, stating that only God knew which was better. Even in his final hours, Socrates maintained his composure, his commitment to his principles unwavering. His disciples, distraught and desperate, had arranged an escape. Crito had secured the means, the guards were bribed, the path to freedom was clear. But Socrates refused. His decision, often seen as an act of ultimate civic duty, also reveals a complex relationship with the very state that condemned him. Crito pleaded with him, tears streaming down his face, insisting everything was arranged for his escape, begging him to think of his sons. Socrates reminded that he had always taught never do wrong, even when wronged, and argued that escaping would mean breaking the very laws he had lived under, making him a destroyer of the state and a hypocrite. He then took the cup from his executioner. Socrates calmly asked the executioner what he must do. Socrates nodded, raised the cup, and drank the hemlock without hesitation. Socrates' refusal to escape, his acceptance of the state's unjust sentence, is a point of contention. Some argue it was a tragic capitulation, a missed opportunity to defy tyranny. Others see it as the ultimate act of integrity, a demonstration that true freedom lies not in escaping consequences, but in remaining true to one's principles, even unto death. His death underscores the state's capacity for violence against its own citizens when its authority is challenged, even by peaceful philosophical inquiry. It shows that the impulse to silence dissent, to enforce conformity, is not limited to wartime, but is an ever-present danger when power is unchecked. Socrates walked slowly, his legs growing heavy. He then lay down. His disciples gathered around him, sobbing. With weakening voice, Socrates' last words were to Crito, reminding him that they owed a rooster to Asclepius, urging him to pay it and not neglect it. His breath ceased. Socrates' final words, a simple request to pay a religious debt, are a final testament to his piety and his adherence to civic customs, even in death. His execution, though carried out by the state, was not a victory for Athens. It silenced a voice that challenged complacency, that pushed for self-examination, that sought truth above all else. His death became a stark warning. The state, even a democratic one, can become an instrument of oppression when fear and conformity overshadow the pursuit of truth and individual liberty. The Trial of Socrates stands as a timeless, cautionary tale. It illustrates the inherent tension between individual freedom of thought and the power of the state. When a state feels threatened, whether by external enemies or internal dissent, it often resorts to suppressing ideas, demonizing critics, and enforcing conformity. Socrates' death was a deliberate silencing of a voice that dared to question, to challenge, to think independently. His legacy, however, far outlived his execution. His students, most notably Plato, carried his ideas forward, ensuring that his questions continued to echo through the ages. The very act of his condemnation, intended to quash his influence, instead immemorialized his philosophy and solidified his status as a martyr for intellectual freedom. The charges against him, impiety and corrupting the youth, were not based on concrete harms, but on the perceived threat his ideas posed to the prevailing social and political order. This highlights the state's tendency to define harm broadly enough to include any challenge to its authority or ideology. In its desire for stability and control, the state often prioritizes conformity over the vibrant, sometimes uncomfortable exchange of ideas that's essential for a truly free society. The same mechanisms used to justify war, the demonization of an enemy, the appeal to collective security, the suppression of dissenting voices, can be turned inward against the state's own citizens. Athens, a city that had just emerged from a devastating war and a period of tyranny, was particularly susceptible to this fear-driven impulse. Socrates, by his very nature, was an inconvenient truth-teller in a society that craved simple answers and unquestioning loyalty. His execution, in essence, a domestic act of war against an individual who refused to conform. The story of Socrates forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What is the true measure of a free society? Is it merely the absence of external threats, or is it the unwavering protection of liberty, even when liberties challenge the status quo? When does the state's legitimate role in maintaining order cross the line into tyranny? Socrates' life and death serves as a perpetual challenge to those in power, and a timeless inspiration for those who believe that the unexamined life and the unquestioned state are not worth living under. His legacy reminds us that the fight for intellectual freedom and the right to dissent is an eternal struggle against the ever-present temptation of state control.